Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of Soul Talk with Father Jay and myself. Today we're doing a little bit better than we were last week because we have sound, and we apologize to any of you who were sitting there wondering. Unfortunately, we weren't able to recover the sound on the video, which is such a shame because it was a riveting conversation, believe me. And if Jay disagrees, there's no proof. So I guess you just have to pick which one, yes, you believe.
We sat there for an hour talking to ourselves.
The void. the outright void. It kind of reminds me of way back teaching during COVID was exactly like that. You kind of sat there staring at your camera, hoping for the best, and there was nobody there. And being a person who likes to tell jokes to their students and getting no laughter back in response was a very uncomfortable time. But now you know how that is from last week.
Hey, it was like the silent movies.
Exactly. You could have drawn what you thought we should say. So today we're going to revisit a little bit of the topic that we had last week, but we're also going to give a few more updates, so to speak. If you haven't had a chance yet, we do have a new St. Paul's newsletter. We call it the Beacon of Light, and it comes out Tuesday nights going into Wednesday mornings, depending on when I finish it. And it will have our episode of Soul Talk, it'll have the weekly Mass attached, a couple of readings, reflections, and updates as far as the renewal is concerned, as we know them, praise and worship nights as they're coming up, and a couple of other just things for you to reflect upon. Which brings us to praise and worship night. We are going to have a different type of praise and worship night on the 8th. I apologize. Had to think about it for a minute. On the 8th at St. Paul's, Father Michael Parker, our pastor, will be leading a healing praise and worship night for those that are having either emotional difficulties or spiritual difficulties or physical difficulties. So we hope that you can join us. And it's also going to be different because it's on a Tuesday, the 8th, at 7:30, and it'll also be in the newsletter. And that's different than our usual ones that we do with Father Jay after the 5:30 Mass at about 6 o'clock on Thursdays. So we hope you can join us, and if you have others that you would like to bring to a healing service, please bring them as well. So I think that covers everything on that aspect. Okay. And if you would like to join our mailing list, all you need to do is send an email to stpaulskenmore@gmail.com. Or you can always message us on Facebook and with your email, and we'll add it in. Now let's dive into the topic at hand. Today, to go back from the topic that we were talking about, Jay and I had discussed last week, what do you say to a young person? And by young, there's so many different definitions, but I'm talking maybe 20s to 30s. The people that you really don't see in church that much anymore. What do you say if they were to come and say, bluntly, church isn't relevant. I'm too worried about other things. I don't find relevance in going to church.
And again, that becomes even harder. This past week, since we talked last week, but we talked, I read a couple of articles. And in those articles that were attached to this subject, in a way, it came out that a number of people in this age groupings, however you want to phrase it, first of all, don't believe in God. And so they aren't looking for any relevance in faith or in church because it's something that they don't believe exists to start out with.
But you know, it's actually very interesting because in this entire discussion, and now this will be what? Our third week of it,
You know,
give or take. Again, you missed last week, mea culpa. But I don't think that aspect of it had occurred to me in that direct of a way.
well, I think we've been approaching it from those who ask why it should be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
But when they don't believe in anything that it represents, it's kind of hard to speak to them of it being relevant because it's something they've already rejected. How do you bring them back? How do you bring them around? And kind of an add on to that, and this was an article basically about pastors, and it was from a Protestant perspective because it was only talking about Protestant churches, to be quite honest. And its big contention was that it's very hard to attract young people to the seminary, to this theology, to this, because there aren't enough living wage jobs for them out there. A lot of these Protestant churches, mainline churches, spread throughout the country, are in rural areas, less populated areas. You know, you have no problem in the big cities.
Mm-hmm.
But you get to some of these other places, and you know, you have very small congregations.
Well, I remember hearing, because I've worked with some Protestant churches, it was right towards the end of my time with the Lutherans. Their pastor was very sick, and she was getting close to retirement, at the time she was actually getting close to passing away. She had cystic fibrosis. But the biggest talk that everybody had was, we can't afford a full-time pastor. And that was what it went over and over. And I think one of the reasons she held on in a lot of the ways was because she had accepted a lower salary for her full-time work than what had grown into being considered acceptable as a living wage. And I think she knew, should she retire, that whoever came after her would only be considered part-time.
And that's why they were talking about, in this article that I read, about bivocation, needing to have two vocations, a regular job on top of their pastoral job. And that became more difficult. There were people interested, there were young people interested, but they couldn't go forward. And therefore they were missing out on, in the churches, the perspective of this age group.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were some, they did do it, and that was okay, but certainly not enough. The article was talking about, just as we have talked about in the Catholic Church, about other forms, other people, lay people taking over rather than ordained ministers or priests or whatever, elders, whatever.
Well, we've had that conversation multiple times, even here where we've talked about what would that look like. We've talked about even the way that you and I approach things, because I come from, I mean, there's an age difference between us. Hard to tell, I know. But I come at it from looking at a lot, and I'll say a lot of times, my generation thinks, the way that, just to see a different perspective. But I also think that you have an acceptance and an understanding that kind of goes beyond looking, where you actually do look at younger generations. And one of the biggest things that I think is a testament to where you start is acknowledging where they are. Because, and I think being able to say, just like you said, one of the biggest parts of it is there's not a belief in God. I know if you talk to somebody who is from a closer to your generation, I think that would shock them. And it would be very hard for them to admit or begin a conversation with, I know you don't believe. Let's start from there.
Well, definitely. I mean, there's no question about that. And another aspect of one of the articles that I read was the fact that basically in these Protestant churches, like the Catholic Church in many instances, the worshipers, those who regularly come to church, are the older people. They aren't young people, they're the older people. I mean, that's not a rule, but that is kind of a predominance, let's put it that way. And, you know, standing at an altar, I can see that in many places. Now, that changes from parish to parish, and I'm going to be honest about that, because it also has to do with the population in a certain area. Certain areas have an older population than others, so naturally the people are going to be older. But still in all, it's one of the things that I so often see. And, you know, as a priest, I guess I kind of get used to the fact that I am speaking, when I preach, to that group.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, perhaps I'm not hitting on what may be important to a younger group. I mean, I try, but it's very, very difficult to hit both.
To an extent, which gives rise to one of the reasons why I think that this here is so important, is we have to find a way where we can mesh that together, so to speak. Now, Father Michael Lamarca, who is the new pastor of the Tonawandis family, said something that kind of did sit with me in this same vein. As we're talking about relevance of church or growing the church, he talks about one of the pillars of outreach and inreach, which inreach, outreach, inreach, however it is phrased in an odd way because we all have our ideas of what outreach is. There are some churches that it means specifically homebound. There are some churches that mean specifically running a food pantry, etc. But no one is overly clear on inreach. What is this inreach? And there's ways that Father Brian, who is in charge of this, has said it. But one of the points that Father Mike Lamarca said that I think was so relevant is what we should do as a church is do what we do and do it well for the people who are here, because they have a much better ability to attest to what church has given them and how it stays relevant in their lives than we do to a stranger. And I think that was one of the first times I had heard it quite put that way, that if you make sure the people who come every Sunday feel moved, they are more likely to say to somebody else, you know, I love my church. Are you looking for a new one? You should come by. And that sometimes does more than necessarily us going and saying, hi, do you want to come and join us?
Well, I agree with Sean on that one and his assessment of what Father Lamarcus said, that it is true. It is true. It's always been true. Believe it or not, you know, the priests and nuns going out knocking on doors don't do as much of a, or don't have as much of an influence in bringing people in as your next door neighbor, your co-worker, person you play golf with.
But I think in a lot of ways, you know how you sometimes think about things in the past and you have a different view of it from the future. And sometimes that perception of the past is never, well, it's not never, but more often than not, it's not accurate, and it's either rosier or more bleak. I think that that's the idea that we have, possibly, and just putting it out there, because a lot of times movies portray it that way. I think back to Sister Act in this, and not just from the music aspect of Sister Act, where, oh my gosh, they did really good music, and everybody came, which, incidentally, I believe the church had a period right after Sing Unto the Lord came out, one of their new documents, that now it's not new, but I think it's 10 years old at this point. But it was the only way to bring people back to church. Do good music. That will bring, it'll solve all the problems of the church and people will come in. And it obviously isn't the be-all, end-all. As much as I do think music is important, an important part of church, it didn't do the as was promised. But with the image that you had of priests and nun going out, that's the same part of Sister Act, in that the big change was first they did the music, and then the nuns were everywhere, talking to everybody, giving them things, giving them pamphlets, letting them know. And well, it looks great in a Hollywood stance. How often have you been to a store or on the street and somebody's given you a pamphlet? Your initial reaction is not, oh gosh, I'm going to go and check this out. It's, oh my gosh, please leave me alone. Maybe that's just me.
Well, I can certainly back up that statement because I can talk about an incident that happened to me many, many years ago. Actually, it was my senior year in college, which I spent the second semester of in Washington, D.C. And I was flying home for vacation, whatever it was, from classes, and I was in Washington National Airport's Reagan National Airport now. And I got approached by one of the followers of Hare Krishna. And they were really, and I was being polite. I was, not accepting, but I was willing to talk. But they were insistent. Friendly,
but insistent.
At first. And then they gave me this, well, you should read this. And then all of a sudden they wanted $20 for this book that they had given me to read. And then it got a little nasty. Not on my behalf, because I said, I really don't want it. Mm-hmm. But on their behalf. And so, it leaves a bad taste. Let's just say it leaves a bad taste.
Well, and a taste you remember, because now, how many years ago would that have been? But it's still in your mind.
51.
And it's still in your mind.
Yeah.
After all of that time.
That, and also the thing that I've seen so many times from people is, oh God, the Jehovah Witnesses are in the neighborhood. They knock on doors, and people just said they couldn't get rid of them.
And this is a friend that Jay knows well. A friend of mine, Charlie, was nice at one point, but they kept coming back. And Charlie was very, very friendly. And then there was a point where we were together and they came, and the next thing I knew, Charlie had jumped under the coffee table to hide because there was the fear of the insistence. And I think that's a big fear, because people don't want to disappoint people. If you're going out and evangelizing, and people don't want to be mean, but I think what I try and hold to is, if you look at a lot of the Bible passages around Christ giving that mission, I mean evangelization as best as it is, it's in form, but if the people don't want to hear it, what's the exact phrase? Don't let the dust of the town settle on your shoes, or
shake the dust.
Shake the dust from your shoes. And I think that's a very fine line, because yes, we want people to be a part of our community, but we also don't want to force being a part of our community. It's a very hard line, don't you think?
It is. And believe me, I maybe shouldn't have said use the names of the particular things. But they were examples, they popped into my mind. They were real, they were actual. And I don't mean to say that Jehovah Witnesses are not people of faith, that they aren't good people. That isn't what I was trying to say. It was just that a lot of people did not like their missionary approach. And I guess that's what I was trying to say.
And I think that's a decent way of phrasing it. But I think that acknowledges to the fear of what do you do? Wow. You know, that I think is where it comes down to it, because it's always easier, I think, and this is something that the church fights right now, is it's very easy to come up with a list of what not to do. Far more, I think, than coming up with a list of what to do.
Well, there's a lot of that. You know, we can go back to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. It is easier at times to say, just don't do this, don't do that, don't do the next thing. It's easier. It's easier. And to say, well, behave with decorum. Well, what does that mean? You have to have an insight and an understanding and knowledge where, don't yell at people. It's a little easier to understand and say.
And then it becomes, then there's points where appropriate action, because yelling sometimes, unfortunately, as much as we may not like to admit it, becomes the appropriate action given it's difficult. And the thing is, there's no supposition, I think, between us that our little talk show is going to revolutionize the church. There's no supposition that our little time together that we have each week with all of you is going to change things. But I think more than anything, the goal is to say, we all kind of ruminate, think about the same things, because I can tell you the amount of people I've heard in the church, whether it's at St. Christopher's or St. Paul's, back in my time at Abiding Savior, even at Nativity UCC. Where are all the people? Where are all the people? How do I get the people back? Where are all the people? It used to be packed in here. Where are all the people? We're not alone. And that's one of the comments that was made even at our parish council, because I know when Father Brian had given his presentation at St. Andrews for our family, there was a lot of angst. There was a lot of disheartenment. There was a lot of feeling that, gosh, what can we do? Nothing is going to work. And the fact of the matter is, most of the churches in our family, with the exception really of St. Stephen's and to an extent St. John's, were kind of in the same boat. Blessed Sacrament and St. Paul's were kind of in the same boat. Tim's and Andrews were kind of... No one's running super ahead. And I think sometimes to be gentle with ourselves is acknowledging that we are in the same place as we venture and try to come up with a solution. Because if we try and come up with a solution that we start with, I'm the bad guy, I did something wrong, my church screwed up, my church didn't do this, or my church didn't send out an email list, my church messed up and that's the end of church because we didn't, makes it so much more daunting than saying, no, all of us are here, which means that maybe there's a bigger problem. And not to loop back, but goes down to, what do you say if somebody says, well, I don't need to go to church because I don't believe in God? That's a hard thing to respond to. I have mine, but what would you say?
You know, I've often found that difficult to deal with because it's an aspect that is foreign to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's so foreign to my mind that I have difficulty grasping it. Logically, I can grasp it, I understand it. But I don't understand the basis for it. And that presents me with a problem. You know, okay, you know, it goes back to what St. James said in his letter, which basically was, you know, you have faith and I have works. You show me your faith. And that faith may be I don't believe in God. I'll show you my works that underlie my faith. My works point back to God, not to me. My works are because of God. And that's the best that I can possibly do. I can talk about how much comfort, how much peace that people receive through faith in God. I can look at people, and I've told this story numerous times throughout my ministry, that there have been many occasions where I have been astounded, I guess, by the faith of people, and that's come through my anointing people, giving them the sacrament of the sick. I have seen it so many times.
And I can vouch for that because you have said that to me the entire time we've known each other. I think maybe one of our very first conversations about faith in general, and Jay and I have had numerous over the decade plus that we've been very close friends. That's, I think, the very first conversation we had is you said, and I have seen it come sometimes bring spiritual healing, and yes, sometimes physical healing.
But the one thing that stands out to me the most is when I have anointed people who are close to death. They are going to die. They're agitated. They're rambunctious. They may not even be conscious, but they're truly agitated. And this shows up in their bodily not being able to stay still. I've seen this more than once. And after I have anointed them, they calm down. They literally calm down. And that has struck me so many times. You know, it hits me because, you know, you go out and, you know, let's face it, like anybody else, a priest wants to go out and do the things that are enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, going and anointing somebody who's on death's door, being with their family around them, is not what you would normally account as a joyful, enjoyable time. And yet time after time, and I'll say it literally, you go out, I've gone out with a dread feeling about that and come away feeling very good by what I have seen and felt with the person I've anointed and with their families. It's remarkable. It is remarkable. I see the effect of the sacrament. It's not going to bring healing to their body, but it definitely seems to bring healing to their souls, to their minds. They are at peace. And I think that's important, which we all want for people.
Well, and I think that's part of what I would say, because there's two aspects that I go when someone says, well, I don't believe in God, that's why I wouldn't go to church. And I have two aspects that kind of go like this. The first one sounds strange, but it's an acknowledgement of it. And the part of me on that side of it is, yes, but that's not necessarily the full point. And I think what part of that is because of how much I believe in being invested in the community of church and of your world, that I think that is almost not the be-all end-all. This being the one side of it is being a part of a community where you are together is just as important, because you see God in that togetherness. Wherever two or three are gathered, that aspect to me is so important. And that's the one side where one of my answers would be, is that, don't you want to be a part of a community? Don't you want to be a part where people would celebrate and value you, where and this, again, last week was a great conversation you all missed. I'm so sorry. But Jay made a comment about knowing that you have people that you can trust, that you can find, that you can be with, that have a similar value system because you have that shared link is really kind of, I don't want to trivialize it by saying cool, but it's cool. So that's the one response is, yes, you may not believe in God, but being a part of a community is so important. Wouldn't you consider being part of it and seeing that divine in each other? The other aspect, and this touches on a lot of what we talked about last week, is I feel study after study after study has shown that we are at a depression epidemic that is so high with people feeling so lost in themselves. And you know, you can, again, if you had seen last week's episode, going into the idea of you can do anything, and if you don't amount to everything that you wanted to, you're a failure, or however else. I think a lot of the depression comes from we are so into the idea that we are the be-all, end-all. That there's nothing bigger than ourselves, which comes into play a lot with what you said of how people draw so much comfort. I don't believe that we're it. I can't believe that we're it. Now, granted, I'm such a control freak, as you well know, that the idea of completely letting go, I envy. I envy one of my choir members at St. Christopher's, whom I adore, has that ability. She truly, when she wakes up in the morning, she very much can give it all to God. Positive and negative, whatever happens, she truly gives it to God and can truly say with no hesitation the divine mercy of Jesus, I trust you.
And you know, it's funny, because Sean can talk about being such a control freak.
Mm-hmm.
And he is. Once you get to know Sean, you will know one thing about him. He hardly ever has an alcoholic drink.
Mm-hmm.
Hardly ever. And if he does, it's one, usually. Yep. Because he is so afraid of losing control.
Yes.
And that's the reason for it. He has on occasion kind of been pushed in a situation to have a second.
Never a third, because the third is tears.
But he does loosen up a great deal, let's put it that way. He loosens up. And to him, that's losing control.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, so he is who he is because of that. And, you know, that's just the way his mind works, how he controls his existence, who he is. And, you know, that's okay. That's okay. And, you know, it just works that way. But it gives him such an open door to so many other things because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And closes the door to other things.
Yeah.
But that's life. And we all experience that in the who we are. But anyways, that's off topic.
Well, but it all kind of ties together. We are going to, again, we could spend 8 hours, and we brought a little bit of what was talked about last week. This is going to go in the newsletter, as is the next praise night. Jay and I will be planning ours. We're not sure if it's going to be the end of August or with going back to school for me. Jay is going away to Potsdam, I think, right?
Well, South Colton, actually.
Well, yeah. And so we're going to be kind of fiddling on that. We'll keep you updated with other other things that as they come. As we know them, it will go into the newsletter to make sure that everybody is aware. But we will have the healing service, healing praise night with our pastor, Father Michael Parker, on the 8th at 7:30. And we hope that you can come and join us. Next week, we're going to be talking about leadership, which was going to be the topic this week. But, you know, we don't ever want to keep you really beyond 45 minutes, and we don't have Liz pounding on the door saying, time to shut up. But next week, we're going to be talking about leadership and how to be a wise leader and a servant leader, because in today's changing climate, it's very, very hard to be settled. But we hope that you enjoy this week. We hope that you have a blessed week. And we hope that you can also find God in all that you do this week.
Have a good week. God bless.